So we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Jay will be here shortly. His plane's landing, or has landed, and he's on his way. But usually the first part we cover anyway is the stuff I do. So we're going to talk about a lot of detailed stuff, deep dives. So if you're one of those consortia directors that is going to the conference Thursday and Friday, you will not hear most of this stuff on Thursday and Friday. This is more of a deep dive, more in the weeds kind of stuff that you should hear. And then Thursday, Friday is more high level visionary state leaders kind of talking about vision and things that should be happening in the next few years. So here's the agenda. I don't know if we'll go in this order. We're going to cover, and I might go off the agenda a little bit if Jay's really late. Talk about stuff like the fiscal system and the 3-year plan and how it's not a grant and all that fun stuff that we get into. But for now, we'll stay with the agenda, and then I'll ad lib as needed. So really quickly, and this was your homework assignment, and I might have to have some of you stay after school today if you didn't read the class report. How many people read the class report? Are you just saying that because I threatened after school? I mean, so versus how many people read the Measuring Our Success that was out in August? So actually you guys are better than, usually I get 3, like in San Mateo I had 3 people that had read the class report and 4 people that had read Measuring Our Success. And that's, I mean, usually it's about 10%. So I guess you could tell people that if you are concerned about your job this year and next year, maybe read the Measuring Our Success, because that really tells what's going to happen to your job in the next couple of years. And then if you're not going to retire in the next 2 years and you're concerned about your job in the next 5 years, you might want to read the class report, because that tells us where we're going in the next 5 years or so. So if that doesn't wake you up and get red flags and warning bells that you want to go read that report, I don't know what else will get you to do that. But so what's happening right now, of course, we have the director's event this week, but we're working currently on the preliminary report, gathering the data from 16-17 that everyone religiously put into TE, right? All that good data's in TE. We're pulling it out, right? Patty's here from CASAS. She is definitely working on that data, or maybe saw some data coming across. Watch it as it came in, okay. We had a few stragglers that we're working with. Hopefully this year we'll have no stragglers and all complying schools, most of non-WIOA and colleges that aren't used to reporting in TE. We'll talk about that a little bit. All this feeds into the preliminary report that's due at the end of this month. That'll go to the legislature, and we've been meeting, I guess, over the last 3 weeks, we've met with Finance and Legislative Analyst's Office and lead staffers. They have numerous questions, and this will we have 2 more weeks of topics that they want to talk about leading up to this preliminary report at the end of October. So things that they're interested in. The first meeting was on single student identifier. That was exciting because we don't have a single student identifier, but we talked about things like driver's license and social security numbers and SSIDs and all kinds of great concepts that aren't going to work in our system because of the nature of the way our systems work out. So that was, at least we explained to them what's going on. And then the next meeting we had was on fees, program fees. And we do have some language on the K-12 adult school side on WIOA with no fees for ASE, ABE, ESL, which are similar to on the college non-credit side of no fees for non-credit. And so we had discussion about that. The big sticking point was what do we do with K-12 adult CTE and fees with that. So that was an interesting concept. Talked about Pell Grants, and not too many K-12 adult schools or county offices really qualify or are accredited for Pell Grants. So there's a few, maybe like 15 or 20 around the state. So that was an interesting discussion. And then last week we talked about assessment and accountability. And there was confusion about assessment for placement, appraisal for placement versus assessment for student progress. So a lot of people confuse both. It was very confusing discussion. We had Costas there, I was there, other people, we tried to explain it. So it gets very confusing when people try to dive deep into practitioner stuff that you guys deal with on a regular basis. And then when you're looking at two different systems and how they do things, it gets really confusing because not each system does things the same way. So hopefully we've provided an interesting perspective and a lot more detail to people that might be writing legislative language that could affect what we're doing. And then the meeting tomorrow is on teacher reciprocity or minimum quals or teacher qualifications. Now that's a no-brainer, right? That's simple, correct? Not. No. So you have your teacher credentialing commission or California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, is that the one? So they're going to present and talk about the K-12 credentials for adult educators, and then the college academic senate is going to present and talk about the minimum quals for their teachers, and we'll get into all the stuff that was put in that report about a year and a half ago, but no decisions were made. And I know Bill's this has been one of his big, I don't know what you call it, we call it a windmill and Don Quixote, or what do we call that? But anyway, it's a thing that's been festering for a long time. So we'll see what happens. And then the last meeting at the end of the month is on Perkins and WIOA and alignment and what do we do about the federal programming and leveraging and braiding. So that should be an interesting discussion as well. So that all leads up to the end of the month in the preliminary report. So there's a lot of interest in adult education. We've never had meetings like this. I don't know if that's a bad thing. So we have their attention, but at least we have class report. They seem to enjoy reading that and get excited about that. And measuring our success was timely because we have a policy paper we can point to. When they say, what the heck are you guys doing with $500 million? We can point to that. So these are the kind of things that are happening right now. Any questions about that? I'm going to move on. That's kind of the state of the state right now, what's going on. And we'll dive deep into a lot of these topics today. Okay, can you guys see over the, did Diana put you guys way over there because you're SCOE staff? Sorry about that, you know. All right. All right, so everybody knows well, there should be one more, transition down here. Here are the metrics we're using. And so and then the next slide is metrics on steroids. Oh, it was so strong it went past. So within those 6 metrics, there's all these additional metrics. So we're not going to get into that, but it just shows that it's just not those 6 high-level metrics at the state's measuring, but there's also all these other additional metrics that feed into that. And these don't even include other metrics like completion of EL civics co-ops or persistence or 3-point gains or 5-point gains or all the stuff that we used to collect. Now that's not saying you can't go ahead and collect that and you can't hold members accountable to those measurements. We're just not collecting at the state level, but you could at the local level decide what metrics you want to keep members accountable with, along with the statewide metrics. So all these feed into that. I mean, same thing with persistence, that feeds into students achieving these things. So it's interesting. We'll see, and we'll have a little more discussion about performance and what's happening with this, and then this whole 3-year planning and what's going to happen in the future. You should start thinking about how you're going to hold your members accountable, how are you going to measure success, what's going to happen to the funding in the future. It's all going to be related to metrics and performance and things like that. But we're not there yet. We're building that system. So don't panic that maybe you're not reporting everything, or maybe you have members that aren't doing everything they should, but we're heading in that direction. Okay, so data and accountability. Here's that team, that report I talked about, measuring our success. That was the result of 3 months, or actually it was a little more, it's less than 3 months. Started on the end of May, wrapped up towards the end of July. There were 3 teams working on things on assessment, data and accountability, CTE assessment, basic skills assessment. looking at how we're collecting the data. So we had like 35 people from the field. There's one person from labor, and then we think we had 12 from K-12 adult schools and county offices, and 12 from community college credit and non-credit. So it was a really good team. That's the result of that paper, Measuring Our Success, that seems like everyone read now. Sounded like, but if you haven't, you can read it again. So 3 teams, 35 participants, a lot of involvement, 40 hours, 8 meetings over 8 weeks. If you're interested in that process, all the agendas and white papers were posted on our website. If you go to Data and Accountability Teams or Framework, you can see the bios on everyone that was selected, all the white papers. I think there were at least 4 or 5 different white papers that fit into that final policy paper. So really good stuff, a lot of good information of sharing across systems. And so if you're interested, that's available on our website. And then they also referenced a lot of resources. I'm not going to go into each one, but there's so much information that you can draw from for adult education. And these were used to make those decisions. And then here's the website, of course. So you go to Adult Ed Block Grant Framework. And I mean, this goes on and on with all kinds of information. So I'm going to, any questions about that? We're going to get into a little bit of a different topic. Okay, so the one thing I want to point out here, everything stays the same except for this. Community college non-credit, that's the big change this year. For Adult Ed Block Grant, Adult Education, it's community college non-credit program. So those 7 program areas. Does everybody know the 7 program areas? It's kind of like the 5 basic food groups, or so there's like 3 CTE, and then there's adults with disabilities, and their K-12 success, and then you have your ASC, ABE, and your ESL. So those have to be all non-credit on the community college side. And so if you're using the funding for credit or something that's not in that program area, we will not pull that data. We will not have that data from TE. It will not get reported to the legislature. So outcomes related to that will not show up. What will show up is if you're working on like a transitional program, you're doing supportive services. And so we still want to encourage people getting to get their degrees, get into transfer level courses, get into degree applicable courses. But we want to help with that transition. These funds should be used for that transition or to support that transition. We don't really want to be funding credit-bearing courses anymore because there's other funding available for that. So when we pull the data, we'll look at those services, we'll look at those transitional information. Yes?
Can we do a quick survey of the audience of how many we have from K-12 and how many community colleges?
Good idea. So I'm going to say community college first because I'm assuming that's the smaller group, right? How many people that are affiliated with the community college? So we have a few. Okay, welcome. You're not in hostile territory. All the K-12 people like you. It's all right. So is that a problem? I know some of your campuses have very little non-credit. So how are you approaching this policy shift? So like in Feather River, so what are you guys doing about that? I mean, when you saw that with non-credit, obviously there is no non-credit, so what's the consortia thinking about? Right. But you're having community organizations and county services kind of fill in that role as far as offering services? And the colleges is still kind of staying on the sidelines for right now until they see the light, and then for Sierra? All right, so here's another whammy, winger, whatever, you know. So this year everybody has to report into TOPS Pro Enterprise. And that's all because of Patty.
Yeah, it's all my fault.
Yeah, it's all her fault. And you have to report quarterly because when we do the data match with Launchboard, and we'll talk about Launchboard, it's going to be done quarterly with EDD base wage file and EDD employment numbers. So for those of you who are on semester systems and you're saying, what the heck, I won't even have any data to report quarterly, you just go through that process, post your data, And then every quarter we'll update that and match that with Launchboard, and that'll be on the Launchboard webpage. And you go in by member and by consortia and look at that data match. So that's kind of the big thing. We do, for those colleges and non-WIOA members that aren't used to using TE, we're trying to pair you with another college that has the same local MIS system. So like if you use DataTel or Banner or PeopleSoft or Colleague or, I don't know, what's another one I'm missing? I don't know, there's a ton out there. Someone else has possibly already mapped those data elements for the export. And so to make this easier, we're trying to link that. If you have a college member that's having problems with this, we can provide that technical assistance and maybe match you up with someone that's already done this to make it a lot easier. So here's another AEBG TAP reminder. So if you're having problems reporting into TE, you're missing deadlines, you're not showing up to meetings, you're violating some of the assurances that you signed on the annual plan, we can put you in targeted technical assistance with AEBG TAP. It's not like the Witness Protection Program, but it does help bring those members back in line. And so, and the state will document the technical assistance we provide, and if it doesn't work, we can notify the consortium like, hey, this member still, after several rounds of targeted technical assistance, still isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that gives the consortia the ability to reduce their funding if they choose to. Now the funding would go back to the consortium. You could reallocate that to other members. So it doesn't come back to the state. We don't want your money. We don't need your money. You guys take care of it. So any questions about that? I think this was always in the legislation about member effectiveness and reasonable intervention, but we never had AEBG TAP available to provide that reasonable intervention. So now that they're on board, we're going to take advantage of that. And if you're having problems with a member that's maybe not adhering to all those requirements, you don't have to be the bad person. You can rely on AEBG TAP to provide that targeted technical assistance. And that's documented at the state level. And if things don't go right, you have recourse to reduce their funding. Hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but at least you have that flexibility to encourage that member if they're not showing up or not doing what they're supposed to be doing as far as all those 15 or 20 requirements for the funding. Any questions about that? Anybody want to share that they have a member that needs targeted technical assistance? Okay. It's not that kind of support group yet, right?
It's continuous improvement. It's not, banished to the cornfield kind of stuff.
In some cases, yeah. No. No, I agree. Hopefully we never have a reduction in funding because of member ineffectiveness, but we do have like 450 members, so there's got to be some rotten apples in that barrel, right? Just don't know. All right, so programs for 17, 18. Jay usually does this, but before we get into this, does everybody realize this is not a grant? Even though we say block grant, it's not a grant. Even though everything says grant and we set it up as a grant, it's not a grant. So we're trying to fix that, and we're trying to talk to finance about taking it out and putting adult education, leaving out the block grant term. So the block grant, we're hoping to do away with that term. We've talked to our fiscal people. On the community college side, we've put it in Exhibit A, which is an exhibit. They put all the apportionment and categorical funding. So when accounting people on the community college side look at Exhibit A, they go, oh, what's this block grant doing in here? I thought that was a grant. And they go, no, it's a categorical. So that's been working a little bit better for us. On the K-12 county office side, we realized from input from the field that I think it's resource code, is it 6390 or 6391, somewhat can be used for grants. And so we're asking CDE to look at that resource code to say, is that what you really intended? Or was that back in the day when everybody thought it was a block grant and you assigned this resource code that's used for grants? And so maybe that's when the accounting people at the K-12 and county office levels see this object code, they go, oh, it's a grant because that's the one we use for grants. And so those kind of things, you know, kind of down deep in the weeds, behind the scenes stuff of, I mean, even someone sent me a question just last night about, oh, so do we use, and it's even from our question and answer, our FAQs, we lay out, well, if it's a reimbursable contract for the grant, you know, you use this object code. If it's a pass-through, you use this. So we still, even in our own question and answer, we still kind of answer things like it's a grant. So we've got to update that information and clean that up a little bit. So moving forward, and that's when, you know, the first year of this program, we were treating it like a reimbursable until that 45-day trailer bill came into effect. So there were ways that you could code this money because it was a reimbursable. You're saying, I'm going to give you this money, you have to do these things, and I'm not going to give you any more until you show me you've done these things. So now that doesn't happen like that. It gets passed through, but we still have this old language out there that confuses people. So,
So we're here talking about programs. So I don't know if this one was addressed, but this one I think everybody kind of has down pat. So what we're getting into here with programs is we have kind of our usual suspects that everybody knows about, and then another handful that people are a little fuzzy on. These are obviously the ones that everybody knows well. These are the ones I'd call the usual suspects. The 3 WIOA 2 programs, and that plus CTE, pretty much everybody knows what these are about. I won't read the definitions, but obviously these comprise kind of the backbone of ABG, you might say. We're got the main programs, and now we're moving on to the programs where we're a little bit less familiar. Okay, so starting with adults with disabilities, this one I don't think is too confusing for folks, but it has generated some questions. I would say that for the most part, the confusion about adults with disabilities boils down to one question, which is, you know, when do I need to mark adults with disabilities versus when do I just mark somebody as special needs or disabled and not necessarily mark that as a class. So long story short, you do have those classes where you would mark instructional program adults with disabilities. It doesn't have to be for this specific group, but you might say usually adults with disabilities means intellectual or developmental disabilities. That's not to say that's the only type of adults with disabilities class, period. But in most cases, we're talking about intellectual developmental disabilities. That is a class that's completely focused on serving that population. You would mark at the class level and student level as adults with disabilities. On the other hand, you might have somebody who happens to have a disability who's enrolled in a regular CTE class or a regular ABE class or whatever. In that case, you would not mark adults with disabilities. You would just mark the student and the class as ABE or CTE or whatever the specific class happens to be. And then at the student level, you can mark that student as disabled under barriers to employment and or mark special needs under special programs. But in that case, again, it's not an adults with disabilities class. It's a regular class that just happens to have an individual or individuals who have disabilities. So you mark that at individual level, but you don't mark that at the class or program level. Does that at least make sense? Okay. So moving along here, this is just instructions for the CCCCOMIS. I'm not going to read that off. So moving on to the next program, we have workforce reentry. So I'd say this one is a lot more confusing. Adults with disabilities, not really that much confusion, but workforce reentry has caused a great deal of confusion with just about everybody. Trying to make a long story short, I think the problem has been on our end and everybody else's. There's been an effort to try to designate it, you know, with something other than a program. We have 7 programs. And there's this one that we keep using, you know, special programs or barriers to employment or age brackets or other things that just don't quite cut the mustard in terms of accurately defining the population. What we did last year is we used special programs, older adults. Our original conception of what this was supposed to be about was a program to serve adults 55 years and up, and you ask me, I'd still say that was the original intent of the legislature, to have something workforce related for adults 55 and up. But it's obviously morphed into something more to that. If you happen to have adults 55 years or older who are doing that, that's definitely A-okay, but it definitely seems like it's morphed into these kind of programs for all students, not necessarily just students who are 55 years and up. So there's lots of other ways people have been using to market. So what we're going to do, I don't think it will really show up in Enterprise if you did it right this moment, but we're going to use the workforce readiness field to designate workforce reentry. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's really close. And quite frankly, about half the field use that to mark workforce reentry as it is anyway. So given half the field is, kind of did that by mistake last year anyway, we're just going to go ahead and assume it's not a mistake and start using it, because we really need something to define it as a program and not using barriers or special programs or some of the other things to record it that's way less than 100% precise. Just more general clarification, it's still okay to have this for older adults. It's still okay to mark special programs older adults if the program at your agency is still kind of more along the lines of the original intent. If you have any specific barriers you're serving, you can certainly mark that. There were a lot of summer discussions about these classes serving not just older adults, but in some cases, homeless or displaced homemakers or some of those other barriers. So if you're focusing on one or more of the barriers, you can certainly use the different fields under barriers to stipulate, what specific type of class it is as well. Okay, so pre-apprenticeship, not many people really have this. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have a pre-apprenticeship program that you've been reporting? Okay, I see one hand go up. Maybe I'm missing one, but I just saw one, okay, and that's pretty much par for the course. At most places, there's been very, very few really getting involved with this, so it doesn't affect that many people. But I would just say the main thing about pre-apprenticeship is you can see it's got a little list here. This is a little bit better slide here, I think, as it gives you some bullets of some good characteristics of a good pre-apprenticeship program. I think the bottom line, though, for pre-apprenticeship is this bottom bullet. In order for you to consider it a pre-apprenticeship program, you need to have that formal agreement in place with the actual apprenticeship program in order to have it be pre-apprenticeship. So you should have something, with the apprenticeship partner that shows that you're pre-apprenticeship. And adults training to support child success. You might say workforce reentry, I think, has morphed pretty well on the program side and lots of good initiatives to serve students, but lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of confusion on the data side. On this one, you might say the opposite. On the data side, it's pretty clear. We have that program established and marked, and that's what everybody's using. So on the data side, I think everybody's pretty clear how to mark it, but there has been a lot of confusion more on the program side. We've heard wide-ranging examples across the state in terms of what types of activities people are doing to address training to support child school success. Some are directly working with parents, some are working more with instructors, some are more just providing services for community members at large. It really seems all over the map to me in terms of what they're bringing up, but the definition is providing and training to adults, usually parents or community members, to help school-age children succeed in school. So that's obviously broad. So it's all those examples I mentioned are all perfectly appropriate. But ultimately it should be focused on the students. Ultimately getting K-12 success. So data-wise, this one's simple. Lots of different initiatives you might say on the program side. Okay, so let's go ahead and transition here. So up to this point, whether it was Neil's part or mine, we've pretty much been talking about a lot of new initiatives, things that came up over the summer, things that we weren't really talking about last spring. Now we're definitely getting more into tried and true sort of stuff. So about half of you have probably heard this 10 or 12 or 20 or 50 times before. Some of you have never heard it before. Obviously, we're going lowest common denominator here, but just giving a state and federal overview. Last spring when we did trainings, a big push for that was that we aligned to WIOA, meaning that we're aligning ABG to the state WIOA and the federal WIOA system. So we spent a lot of time talking about what that means. So some of you kind of have that down pat. Some of you do, some of you don't. So we'll kind of reiterate how we're aligning to the federal system. So we'll start kind of at the top with the feds here and talk about the national reporting system. So the short answer is, if we're talking about national reporting system or NRS, we're referring to the feds. To be fair to the NRS, they're not really the feds. They're contracted by the feds to provide a means of regular evaluation for adult education nationwide. So it started in the 1990s. It was an effort on behalf of the feds at looking at aligning adult ed to tangible outcomes. So in the 90s, the feds went to different providers, went to different states and asked, what are the outcomes we're all looking for our students to achieve? Came up with a good list of outcomes. It started as a voluntary effort for a few years. 1998 is when I like to say it became not so voluntary. 1998 is when the Workforce Investment Act federal legislation was passed. So the Workforce Investment Act, or WIA, was this huge piece of federal legislation covering lots and lots and lots of different things. My oversimplified way of describing it over the years is it's that valuable federal legislation providing those federal grant dollars in exchange for the detailed testing and detailed data collection we all know and love today. So from 1998 to 2016, we were under the auspices of WIA. In 2014, the Innovation and Opportunity Act was passed, or WIOA. They passed WIOA in 2014 with the idea to have WIOA go into effect and essentially replace WIA starting July 1, 2016. So the long story short, kind of good news and bad news, below. The good news is we did go ahead and proceed on July 1, 2016, we launched WIOA. We got going on time as we were hoping to, or the Fed said, or whatever. But it's kind of the bad news too, because you might say we've been reeling with this, ever since, July of 2016. Some things were firmly in place, lots of other things, not so well in place. So we're still looking at putting a lot of the pieces together for things where we're kind of waiting on the feds to come up with guidelines on this, that, and the other thing. So we got going on time, but there's still a lot of process that we're still kind of waiting on, you might say. But long story short is we did get off the ground in 2016. We've got a year or so under our belts, and at least as far as the legislation goes, we're basically good through June of 2020. That's how long the legislation is slated to last. Okay, so moving along here. All right, so here's some resources if you want more federal-related information. nrsweb.org, that's the official NRS website. Lots of good information there, including lots of information on the new federal reporting tables that went into effect last year. And then doleta.gov, that's Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration. That's the federal website that they've been using for all things WIOA. So what I like to say is if you want to kind of find out everything you'd ever want to know about WIOA and more, you can go to this website, including downloading the 2,000 or 3,000 pages of federal legislation if you really want to, get down to brass tacks with it. Okay, so moving along, this is a little bit of a description of WIOA. I like to set up that it kind of shows how WIA and WIOA are the same. It also kind of shows how WIA and WIOA are different. So the way it shows it's the same is that WIA had 4 title numbers. WIOA has the exact same 4 title numbers as what we had under WIA. You can see titles 1, 2, 3, and 4. Under both WIA and WIOA, we're Title 2. That is the component of WIA or WIOA that pertains to adult education and literacy. Now that we're under WIOA, you might say the one with the lion's share of authority, the one with the lion's share of responsibility is Title I. Those are the workforce development boards, or workforce programs, under WIOA, they're the ones who pretty much synthesize everything at the local level. So you see we have the 4 title numbers. Again, Title I workforce, we're Title II adult literacy, Title III Wagner-Pizer, one-stops, that's kind of short-term workforce, and then Title IV voc rehab, that's serving individuals with disabilities and individuals receiving workers' compensation. So those are the 4 title numbers, again, under WIOA, the same as what they were under WIA. It also kind of shows how it's different, though, because what I would say is when we had a WIA audience a few years ago, if we ever talked about this sort of stuff, bringing up what some of the other folks did under WIA, pretty much nobody knew what any of it was about. People were completely unfamiliar with these other title numbers. Now that we've got a year or so of WIOA under our belts, now pretty much everybody knows who these other 4 title numbers are. Lots of you have been working on that MOU Phase 1 and Phase 2 over the last year or so. So now everybody's a lot more familiar with what these other guys do. Okay, so digging in a little bit, we have what are called performance indicators. So at the federal level, and just to be clear, this extends across all 4 title numbers. WIOA-wide at the federal level, we have performance indicators that California and all states are required to report. So effectiveness to employers, employment after 2 and 4 quarters, wages, credential attainment rate, and measurable skill gains. So measurable skill gains, you might say, is where we kind of get into the details, and the feds list 5 specific measurable skill gains: literacy, secondary, post-secondary, training milestone, and skills progression. Here's the 5 types of MSG here, same thing, is they kind of dig down and get into these measurable skill gain. What I like to bring up here is, my take on measurable skill gain is it's an effort at the federal level, state level, and everybody else, you might say, to look at different ways in which we can come up with, means of showing how our students are doing a great job. Obviously, when we're looking at state and federal outcomes, sometimes it focuses on that final prize. If you look at performance indicators, you might say it's that big final prize: getting a job, getting a pay raise, getting your occupational licensure, getting your GED, getting your college diploma, and et cetera. That is, when it's focused on the final prize, obviously all those outcomes are great, but if we focus just on those final outcomes, the majority of our students may not necessarily show much for the year, because it obviously takes a while to get a job and takes a while to get your diploma, takes a while to get that occupational licensure and so on. So a lot of our students, if not the majority, look like they're not doing much if we just focus on that in a given year, because again, it takes students a few years to get those different things. So that measurable skill gain concept is an effort to come up with ways where we can show that our students are doing a great job and making excellent progress during the year without necessarily relying on that job or occupational licensure, diploma, or whatever that you might call the quote-unquote final prize. So I bring this up because the feds have gone to painstaking effort under WIA and WIOA to define a lot of this. In an ABG, it's really clear that that's kind of where we're getting our outcomes, as we're looking at that measurable skill gain concept and borrowing them and kind of bringing them into our own state system for our own use. So what I mean by this is, here's kind of the correlation here. As you see, we've got the performance indicators and measurable skill gain in the federal system. If you look at our California state system under AB 104, you might say, not so coincidentally, a lot of the outcomes we're doing from ABG look a whole lot like the things we've already been tracking at the state and federal level for WIOA. In some cases, the titles are almost word for word the same. So does everybody at least see this connection between what we're doing for ABG and that federal concept of measurable skill gain? Okie doke. So moving along here into some specific data collection guidelines. So we'll start with the timeline. Some of you know this backwards and forwards, some of you not so much, but I'll just start lowest common denominator by saying when we're talking about state and federal reporting, we're always talking about fiscal year, not calendar year, right? So whenever we're talking about the year, it's always starting on July 1 and ending on June 30th. So if you take that fiscal year and divide it into quarters, July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June, those are our 4 quarters. We take the last day of the quarter and fast forward 1 month. So for example, the last day of the first quarter is September 30th. Fast forward 1 month, that's our due date, October 31. Okay, and so on down the line for the other quarters. So does everybody have that due date system down? Okay, the big confusion point I would say for the due date thing is that every quarter starts on July 1. This is one of those things that I didn't really realize was confusing until everybody got confused by it. But in any case, the first quarter is July 1 to September 30th. Second quarter is July 1 to December 31, and so on. Does everybody see how if we did July 1 to September 30 and then did like October 1 to December 31 and did it strictly by quarters, you'd be guaranteed to get all kinds of pre-tests but no post-tests, missing hours, missing enrollments, and so on. If we did it on a strictly quarterly basis, it's safe to say everybody's data would be nothing other than a big stinking mess. Does everybody see why that's true? Okay, so it always starts July 1 and moves on, and obviously then for the 4th quarter, it's end of year, submitting the data for the entire year, July 1 to June 30th. Okay, everybody clear about that? Okay, so we talked about the date range. Here's what you actually bring in. So it says submit. You know, I like to say you don't really have to submit anything. You're all online, so we get your data automatically, so there's nothing physically you really need to do with your data because we have it already. But you just basically go up to date and kind of based on your question from earlier, you know, it's that quarterly date range. So like on October 31, you should have everything up to date through September 30th. If you've still got a stack of stuff in October you didn't scan, that doesn't matter because again, you're just covering through September 30th. But if you've got some September stuff, you want to get that all in before you submit on October 31. Then we also have a report called the Data Integrity Report. I call that kind of the everything but the kitchen sink report. It has some enrollment information. It has hours of instruction information. It has pre and post testing information. It has stuff on outcomes. It has a little bit of everything. But that's the report that each agency submits with the data. So we use that because the state and, you know, we want to take a look and just kind of see how everybody's doing. But we also use this as kind of a way for everybody to throw their hat in the ring because you're not really needing to submit the data. We're using that submission as the DIR as the cue to us that you've basically done everything you need to do. And that prompts us to go ahead and check your agency's, you know, name off the list saying, yes, you've submitted the data. So you go ahead and submit the DIR to us at CASAS. That's basically you, the agency, saying you've done everything with your data for that quarter. Go ahead and knock yourself out, CASAS. Do whatever it is you need to do with it. That's what the submission of the DIR means. So you submit that DIR each quarter. Then end of year, that's another data submission and another submission of the Data Integrity Report. At the end of the year, we have a report called the ABG Summary that you can also submit. To be clear, the summary you can submit with your end of year, but you do not need to submit the summary each quarter. With the quarter, that's just the DIR and the DIR only. Then that piece about data sharing, that's a little murky right now. If you ask me, I don't think it's going to affect ABG, but I think that's still a little bit TBD. If you're WIOA, it probably will affect you. You know, we've been looking at data matching. It looks like there's probably going to be some kind of survey or something on the WIOA side. As far as I know on the ABG side, not necessarily, but all that for both WIOA and ABG is still a little bit to be determined. But just so you know, that's what that means. A lot of stuff that still needs more state discussion. Okay, so digging in a little bit, before I jump into these next few slides, I'll just point out we at CASAS have what's called an entry record and an update record. They're just answer sheets or scan forms. Some of you use them a lot, some of you don't use them at all. But those are just the answer sheets or bubble forms we've had for years. The entry record records enrollment. The update record records outcomes. If you use it, great. If you don't, fine. But I just bring that up now just to say that's how I present all this information. If you use your own form or you use some other kind of system, fine. But just realize whatever you have on that local form or whatever you have in that local data system, it needs to have all of those fields that we have on the entry and update so you can record all of the same information. So again, entry, you're documenting enrollment for all learners upon entry. That's pretty prescriptive. I say document enrollment as soon as that student sets foot in the door. That's day one, square one of any student involvement. You want to immediately document enrollment. Provide update for everyone who has 12 or more hours of instruction. So you might have a student that shows up. Maybe they show up for a cup of coffee. They're there for 3 or 4 hours. Then they disappear off the face of the earth. In that example, they did show up. They were there for the short term. So yes, you do want to document enrollment because they were actually there. But until they cross that 12 hours threshold, you don't need to provide any update. But once they do get 12 or more hours, then providing that update is required. And then a couple people mentioned testing. You test everybody in ABE, ESL, and ASE. That is the 3 programs associated with WIOA 2. Okay, so just a little bit on the form. You're just using this to document enrollment. Top half has demographics. Bottom half has programmatic information. Basically, all the information you need to have to record enrollment for the individual. Next is the update record. It does just what the title suggests. It updates everybody's personal information. On the entry, you're indicating you're assigning a person to a program, to a class. On the update, you're indicating the hours. On the entry, you're assigning the person to a level. On the update, you're indicating did they complete a level, advance a level, and so on. On the entry, you're assigning primary, secondary goals. On the update, you're indicating did they or did they not meet said goals, indicating all the outcomes that that student achieved as a result of attending your adult education program. And then the test record is simply what you're using to record answers to a CASAS test and all amplifying information about that test form. Most of you are using e-tests. If you're e-testing, you don't need to use this form at all. But if you're doing pencil paper testing, this is the form you'll want to use. So a little bit on the entry. Obviously, please do collect those demographics, gender, race, ethnicity, date of birth, and so on. A few other key fields to think about. Labor force status is an important one. You've got those education level fields. And then one that I have fussed about a little bit more than others is this field called barriers to employment. We've been doing a lot of fussing about that field over the last year because it was new last year. It didn't exist under WIA. It was introduced under WIOA. But you might say barriers to employment represent the quote unquote hard to reach, hard to serve populations. So at both the federal and state level, they want you to be able to show that you're serving individuals from those populations. There's no requirements like this that I know of, but a lot of people do seem to suggest that down the line, there will be some effort to look at, our homeless, students getting jobs equal to or greater than everybody else, our migrant workers making learning gains equal to or greater than everybody else. That is, are those hard to reach, hard to serve populations performing the same? Okay, then we talked about barriers. Another new thing that didn't really exist under WIA is there's a field called personal status. It's field 16 where you have WIOA 1, 3, and 4. So, this is something that both the state and feds are really interested in. If you have students co-enrolled in those other WIOA programs, you want to go ahead and mark it. It's understood a lot of times you won't know that, but if you do know that, to the maximum extent possible, try to indicate that if you can. Okay, update records. So we talked about for entries, very prescriptive. Do the entries on day one, square one. That is as soon as the student sets foot inside your doorway. Updates a lot less specific. It says do updates after a quote unquote substantial block of instruction. That substantial block of instruction means different things to different agencies. Some have a semester system, maybe trimester, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly. You know, different agencies have different systems based on your course schedule or your academic calendar and so on. What we say is it doesn't really matter if you do it on a trimester basis or quarterly basis or whatever. The data suggests all those methods are roughly equal. What we do say, though, is it's a good idea to figure out how your course schedule or academic calendar is set and make sure that all classes, all programs basically do it the same way. If it's willy-nilly where everybody does it different, that's when agencies kind of get themselves in trouble. So it is good to have a uniform system locally and have everybody just follow that system. So a couple of you have mentioned services. The one time I like to give a specific TE menu item is for this slide. Go to Records, Students, in Program Years. You can see it right there on the slide. But I give a specific TE menu direction for this purpose. Number one, just because a lot of people have said for these services, you know, it's easier to directly mark it in TE than scan it when you just have those three bubbles, or import it when you've just got a small amount of information. So anecdotally, this is the one time when a lot of people are saying they're just typing it directly in TE. So for the record, that's student or record students in program years. The other reason why I give this specific menu direction is a lot of you are saying, well, we do services. We can see that it's these three categories. That's fine. But a lot of people are a little confused about what the difference is between supportive training and transition. And admittedly, the distinction at the state level is minimal at best. So the best answer I've come up for this one is if you go to record students in program years, you'll see three screens. You know, one labeled supportive, one labeled training, and one labeled transition. There's about 8 or 10 check boxes in each section. So at least you can look at those check boxes and kind of get some examples for each of the three categories. If you're a little one, you know you have a service, but you're not quite sure which one, you can go into that menu in TE and mark the appropriate service based on that laundry list you see in those areas for some guidance as opposed to none at all. So again, you can go to that section in TE, or that's update field 8, mark one of those three bubbles that you see there. And then again, we've kind of covered this piecemeal with some of the questions, but just to be clear, on the services side, as long as you have an ID and you've marked the appropriate services, it will be recorded. Ideally, you want to get the demographics in for these students, but if the demographics are incomplete, you'll still get credited with the service. And as we've said, you can mark hours if you want, but they're not mandatory. Similarly, class enrollment and program enrollment, perfectly A-OK, but not mandatory if all you're really recording are the short-term services. So the last slide in this section is, you know, this is more of a year ago, but there's no big changes this year, but last year, there were major changes to these forms back to the moving out of WIA and into WIOA issue. So the forms changed a lot a year ago. The bottom line is when these forms changed, in order to be WIOA compliant, we had to start including the fields for Title 1, 2, 3, and 4. Under WIA, we just had the Title 2 fields. That's all we needed. But for WIOA, we were required to have all the outcomes for everybody. So what a lot of people have been noting over the last year is there's lots of bubbles on the form that don't make any sense, that you'll never use, that don't apply to your students, and so on. The final word is, if that's true, the short answer is don't be too concerned. You're just like everybody else. It's understood a lot of these bubbles pertain to the other title numbers and may never pertain to you or your students. If that's the case, that just makes you like everybody else. I wouldn't be too concerned if you have bubbles that you don't really use too much. Okay, so I did kind of leave off in midstream a little bit because we were a few slides behind. I wanted to just get everybody up and running on break. But we did kind of change gears on topic, so a little bit on pre-post testing, not much. To be clear, if you were wanting a lot of information on pre and post testing, there's the training, I think, at the main SCOE site tomorrow morning. That'll be 3 hours on nonstop pre and post testing. So because we have the 3-hour training tomorrow, we don't talk too much about it here today. But a few things that just relate to accountability. So just for starters, the testing is required for For the WIOA 2 programs, again, that's ABE, ASE, and ESL. So it's not required for all ABG students, but it is required for those 3 programs. You can use any federally approved assessment tool. So for WIOA 2 in California, everybody uses CASAS. For ABG, you can use anything that the feds approve. I'll add that that's a pretty short list. You know, we're one of about 4 or 5 publishers nationwide on the list. So the list is not that long, but bottom line is it's not necessarily restricted to CASAS. It's any publisher that's on that federally approved list that's authorized for ABG. So a little bit on pre and post testing. Pre-test, you know, upon enrollment, you know, that's another day one, square one sort of issue. Post-test is a little looser, a little bit more like updates. You kind of align it to your own agency's schedule. You know, what we say at CASAS is post-test after approximately 70 hours of instruction. That's kind of what we would say the quote-unquote 4 best results. Make sure you use these products after at least 70 hours of instruction. The pre-testing I'd like to fuss a little bit about and just kind of remind, you know, obviously you want to pre-test right away because the policy says so, but it's really a more important issue for you than it is for us. Why is pre-testing right away such a good idea for you? That's right. So why does pre-testing right away increase the potential for growth? That's right. You want to get it before they do the instruction. So as I am fond of saying, you don't want to allow any of that dastardly learning to take place before you get the student pre-tested. If you do that, you know, then you're going to get the test after they've learned. They'll pre-test at a higher level of performance. If they pre-test at that higher level, obviously the growth will decrease. You want to get them on day one when they're at a low level of performance. The name of the game is not for the student to ace the test. The name of the game is for, you know, you to be able to maximize growth. One way you do that is by pre-testing the first day and that thereby getting the most amount of growth for each student possible. Okay, here is that list. If you want to go to the website that lists all of those approved assessments, here it is. Again, anything on that list is authorized for ABG. Like I said, it includes more than just CASAS, but what I will say, the list is a fairly short list of what's on here. If you're talking modalities for ABE, ASE learners, use reading or math assessments. For ESL, use reading or listening. In order for it to comprise an appropriate pre-post test, it's got to be from the same modality, so you can't do like a reading pre-test and try to match it up with the listening post. It's got to be reading, reading, or listening, listening. Okay, and then there's obviously way more questions we could have here, but here's one FAQ that we put on the slide just because it's been asked so many times. But for people doing HSC or high school diploma, you have the quote-unquote higher level students. So there's sometimes concern or questions about whether to test them if they're really high level. Is that really worth your time or the students? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. What we've provided for guidance is the cutoff of 236. So we would say, yes, go ahead and pre-test everybody. If they pre-test below 236, then they're right in the bailiwick for federal, state and federal reporting. They're right there in the CASAS domain, so to speak. So if they get below 236, we say, yeah, definitely post-test. If they get above 236, though, then they're kind of moving higher. So if they pre-test above 236, it's okay to forego the post-test. We use the magic number of 236 for this question because that's the number in CASAS land that basically is the cutoff where, you know, where ABE ends and ASE begins. So you don't have to follow that exactly, but that's our recommendation of, you know, above 236. You don't have to. Below 236, you do. Some people in WIOA land get confused by this because if we were in WIOA, just to be clear, we would probably say that cutoff is 246 because that's really where the cutoff comes in on where payment points are affected. But because ABG doesn't have payment points, we'll keep it simpler and just use 236. where ABE ends and ASE begins. Does that make sense, yes or no? Okay, so moving into outcomes. So this might, you might say, is kind of getting more into feature presentation here. So before we jump into outcomes, there's just one slide here kind of qualifying it all out, just on populations. We have the number of adults served, which we just define as anybody with an hour or more. And then we have the adults who attain milestones or outcomes. That's where we're aligning to WIOA. That's where we're requiring things like demographics and 12 hours of instruction. Does that make sense, yes or no? Okay, so before we get too far, just to bring that up. So we referenced it very briefly earlier where we have those 6 areas under AB 104. So a few years ago, the state legislature passed AB 104 where they very carefully defined the outcomes that we would be required to track under ABG. They defined 6 areas. Here they are with the 6 little pretty colored blocks. If you like the laundry list format better, here's the same 6 areas, just in a different format. So if you like the visual, there's slide 1. If you like the laundry list, there's slide 2. So we've got those 6 areas. Again, as we showed in that measurable skill gain section, not so coincidentally, pretty much directly derived from, what the feds had already set. Okay, so one big difference between ABG and WIOA, one thing that's caused maybe a little bit of confusion, is we're using a combination of data match and self-reported outcomes. So again, it's not one or the other, it's both at once. Our idea is we're going to be doing data match, we're going to be doing self-reported data, as long as we're careful to define what's from the data match and what isn't. We feel like we'll be on firm footing. Some things will be using data match, some will be using direct report and TE, lots of things will be using both. We'll get more in that toward the end of this section, but just to clarify. Okay, so we've got those 6 areas. The first of those 6 areas we're going to talk about is improved literacy gains. So obviously the majority of improved literacy gains, most of what we're talking about are those pre-post test learning gains. That's going to be probably the majority of what gets reported in this area are the gains you make from pre-test to post-test. Again, mostly for ABE, ESL, ASE. But there are 4 other outcomes that are potentially earnable. On the college side, if the person gets that CDCP certificate, that can potentially be counted as a literacy gain. On the WIOA side, we have a concept called Carnegie units, which is a standardized way of collecting high school diploma credits. What we found over the summer is pretty close to nobody uses Carnegie units. So we know right away that that's not going to be a very useful way to track gains in California. But we are going to address that federal requirement by looking at instructional level. More on that later. But bottom line is if you have a high school diploma program and you're measuring student progress through high school credits, there is a way to get a literacy gain outcome in ABG for that. Okay, so we have the high school credits, and then we have 2 new metrics that we didn't have last year, primarily for career tech ed sort of programs, one called occupational skills gain, one called workforce readiness milestone. We'll get into that here soon. Okay, but we'll start with the pre-post. That's the first one under literacy gains. Obviously, that's the one that the student achieves by making gains between the pre-test and the post-test, specifically making enough progress to move up 1 level on the federal chart. And like we've said a couple times already, you must use the pre-post assessments approved by the NRS or the feds. Okay, so here's the chart for the CASA system. So just to give the same example I've given for a long time, if we have an ESL student that pre-tests in that 201 to 210 range, they're going to place into ESL intermediate low. The reason why I say that automatically is everyone who gets a pre-test between in that 201 to 210 range places into that level. The pre-test is what determines which level the student gets into. Then that student would need a 210 or better to complete a level that is a post-test equal to or greater than the high end of that particular level. If they're low intermediate, they'd need the 210 or better. If they're high intermediate, they'd need the 220 or better, and so on. That's the method you would use to determine. That's just the federal system. That's how we've aligned our system to make sure you can use all 12 of those federal levels. Is everybody clear about that? And everybody's clear about that example? Okay. All right. So, looking at the certificate, you can, if you get a CDCP certificate in the college system, you can mark mastered course competencies or skills progression. So somebody somewhere along the line was asking about the bubbles. This is by no means the end, but here's our first, little bubble example here where, we've tried as much as possible to identify specific bubbles that equate to each one of these outcomes. So it's really clear and you don't have to guess. So again, you could come up with lots of other appropriate examples, but the ones we're coming up that are going to equate to these exact outcomes are mastered course competencies and skills progression if they get that CDCP certificate. So here's the one, somebody back there was asking about the high school credits. So again, in the federal system, and the reason why we have this under ABG is what they've defined in the federal system with Carnegie units, where the feds have specified if students make certain progress based on that Carnegie unit system, they can get a literacy gain outcome for federal reporting. So again, nobody uses that, so we don't think that Carnegie unit system is going to really work, just because nobody really uses it. So what we've come up with as an alternative is just to allow each local agency to use your own district credit system. 10 districts, probably 10 slightly different ways of managing it. So just use whatever method your district uses to do credits and make sure you've got all the paperwork and so on at the district level. So if anybody checks up, you can easily show that those students made progress, through high school credits. The way we're using it in TE is we're basically just saying when the student enrolls, they're at the ASE low level. So normally when we're talking about this, they're placing into that level through testing. In this case, we're not talking about testing. We're just talking about that self-reported level field, which is field 18 on the entry form, and you're just marking ASE low to show that they're an ASE low level student at the beginning. And then once you do the update at the end of the year, you would then just self-report that they're an ASE high student at the end of the year. ASE low is the federal level that equates to the 9th and 10th grade levels. ASE high is the federal level that equates to the 11th and 12th grade levels. So basically, you're just self-reporting for that student in your data that the student started at the 9th or 10th grade level and finished at the 11th or 12th grade level. That is, they made enough progress through credits to make that outcome, in the federal system. Does that make sense, yes or no? So again, they're starting as ASE low, starting as ASE high. What I'll just say is if they start as ASE low, or they could start as ASE high, and they actually get the diploma. So we're basically saying, yeah, if they get the diploma, that also counts. If we only said ASE high, well, then we're kind of saying, well, if you pole vault 18 feet, you get the credit. But if you get up to 20 feet, you don't. We're going to give credit for 18 feet and 20 feet. Basically, that is, if they get the diploma, they can still get this outcome. So if you can mark earned high school diploma from ASE low, and that will also be a way to track this progress. Does that make sense, yes or no? So again, you're just self-reporting that they're making gains through high school credits. The key thing, of course, is just make sure at the district level you have all the documentation that shows that your district is giving the student these high school credits. And then finally, what I skipped over that's obviously very important, this pertains only to those students in instructional program, high school diploma. Any other program, this is not applicable. Okay, everybody follow all this, yes or no? Okay, all right, so moving on, some easier ones here. So we've got the secondary high school diploma HSE, simply mark earned high school diploma or any one of those three, any one of those three HSE exams authorized in California. Back to literacy gains here, a special note on adults with disabilities. Adults with disabilities is not a program where you're required to pre-post, but a lot of those classes where you've got the designated program adults with disabilities, most do say, yeah. So we just say, yeah, we do have 2 assessments that cost us for this population. One series called Power, one series called the 2A to 5A. These were specifically designed for developmental intellectual disabilities. As an aside, they are approved for WIOA 2 reporting, so they do get California payment points. There's another set of instructions for that I won't get into, but they do get payment points. So if you're interested, just let me know. I'd say over the last maybe 6 months, there's actually been lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of interest in this after 10 or 12 years of having there be no interest at all. So if you are interested, we are kind of looking at setting up trainings and so on. No dates, I'd say we're almost there where we have enough interest, where we'll try to do like 1 north, 1 south or something like that, if possible. So that's for developmental intellectual disabilities. On the other side, if you have a student with a disability, but they're not necessarily in Adults with Disabilities program, it's just somebody in a regular ABE class or a regular CTE class or something like that, then for those students, you would just have them do the same assessments as everybody else. They may need special accommodations, more time, more frequent breaks or something like that. But basically, they should be doing the same ABCD testing that all the other students are doing. Does everybody follow that? Okay, so the other gains that we put under the literacy gains category, mostly for CTE type programs. So we have occupational skill gain and workforce prep milestone. So that occupational skills gain, I'll just say labeled not so coincidentally like measurable skills gain. Mostly it was a metric that we kind of retrofitted for this ABG program specifically. I think everybody feels like we've got everything well set up for, say, ABE, ASE, ESL to show those gains for students without the student getting the final prize. Obviously, you might say that's what the pre and post test system is for, but we didn't really have a metric built in very well for career tech ed, so we had some summer discussions to try to do that. So we came up with this occupational skill gain metric. For now, there's nothing super specific you have to do, but you basically just need to align. Maybe it's a skills check, maybe it's a written test, maybe it's a combination of both that you're using for your career tech ed program. So if a student finishes a semester or finishes a unit or whatever you call, that block of time in your career tech ed program, if the student passes whatever that test or skills check or whatever it is you provide at your program for those students when they complete a block of instruction in career tech ed, you can go ahead and credit that student with an occupational skills gain. So this is still a little bit in progress in terms of specifics, but for now, you just want to align it to whatever you're doing in your career tech ed program now. And again, either a written test or a skills check is considered appropriate. Lots of ways where you could potentially set this up. Any question on occupational skills gain? Okay, and then workforce prep milestone. That's basically more of a shorter term. It says exploratory metric, but in the previous trainings, we've pretty much said, no, it's not exploratory. We pretty much are going to go full bore on it, but this is more shorter term. If you have like a workforce reentry, workforce readiness, they're doing the shorter term of hours, but some of you are mentioning like the resume writing classes or the job interview skills. They complete a course like that and they get a little certificate for completing that class or something like that. That would be an example of a workforce prep milestone. So is this all making sense, yes or no? Yep. Okay. All right, so occupational skills gain. Again, the same definition we just said, a way to show that your career tech ed students are making great progress, but they're not quite ready yet to get their license or final certificate. So they do something in the shorter term to show that they're making great gains. We're using training milestone and work-based project goal as fields you can mark to correlate to occupational skills gain. For workforce prep milestone, we're saying you can mark training milestone or acquired workforce readiness skills. Those are the two bubbles you can use for that particular outcome. Yeah.
So Jay, let's see. Yeah. So there's questions about, well, this isn't a certificate or whatever. So this is where you would put some of those workforce prep milestones, like a localized certificate or ones that don't fall. And Jay's going to show you another slide about what qualifies for a credential for CTE. But if it doesn't qualify, like your Microsoft Office and your CPR and your ServSafe and OSHA, this would be the area to put those. Or if you have locally designated certificates, they could all go here. So don't think that we're ignoring those. This is just a better place to put them because they probably wouldn't qualify under the CTE credential.
Okay, so moving on to post-secondary. So in short, post-secondary has some career tech ed related outcomes. It also has some college related outcomes. So here's more on the CTE side. If they get that final credential or licensure or whatever, that can count as a post-secondary outcome. There's nothing super specific that you have to follow X, Y, and Z in order to mark it, but there are at least some, areas that you can look to kind of provide, some uniform guidance. So some examples would be like the ETPL, that's the WIOA 1 side. If you've got an authorized WIOA 1 provider, that would be one way to look at it. The CDCP certificates on the community college side, they use that 48 hours cutoff as what qualifies as CTE. If it meets Perkins requirements, that's another rule of thumb you could use. If it qualifies for Perkins, then it would qualify here. And then Title IV student aid is another that some have been referencing.
So what you don't see here is locally determined certificate, right? It's pretty specific. It's either Pell related, Perkins related, CDCP, ETPL, or it's 6 credits or more to a degree. That's about it. None of these localized Microsoft Office, these hodgepodge. This is pretty well established. So if you do have something that doesn't fit here, then it's back to the previous slide and workforce readiness.
Maybe back to the final prize analogy, is that like the workforce prep milestone and the skills gain are, substitutes for not getting the final prize. This, you might say, is the final prize where they're getting that licensure, in that designated occupation.
Or the job. The job might be the final.
Okay, so so here's just what Neil said. Here's the slide. This is basically what he just said. Is it's just the specific licensures, not all that other stuff. All right, so we went through here. So again, here's just the different bubbles that you would mark. There's one under work, entered apprenticeship. So if you transition to an apprenticeship program, that would be one example. And then a credential, obviously any of those associate's or bachelor's degrees or graduate degrees. And then the bottom one is the one where we've been doing most of the discussion, that occupational licensure, occupational certificate. Okay, so a little bit on wages, on jobs and wages. Obviously, the primary way we do this is through data match. But again, we're not reporting to the feds for ABG, so we're not required to use data match. We're allowed to use self-report, so we will do it. So simplifying it, in WIOA land, if your student comes up one day and says, yippee, yippee, I got a job, yes, you should mark it, but ultimately that outcome really doesn't mean anything unless you're able to data match it or have a survey or whatever. That self-reported outcome really doesn't mean anything. Again, the feds aren't involved here. So for ABG, that self-reported outcome does mean something. So here, if your student comes in and says, yippee, yippee, I got a job, go ahead and mark it, and it will count as an official ABG outcome. We will be data matching, and we will be providing the data we get out of that data match as well, of course, but we won't be restricting the outcomes to data match and data match only, like what we have to do for federal reporting.
Yeah, so what Jay's saying, and I think the lady in the third row had a question about Social Security numbers and employment reporting. So you'd have the gold standard would be your Social Security number, of course, because that's the only way we can match on the base wage file. Then you have your maybe, I don't know, silver status would be your self-report, or if we do a survey, that could be maybe the silver and the self-report is the bronze. But there's going to be different levels of credibility with the data you'll be reporting. Of course, Social Security number is the best. It only tells us certain things. Survey could dig a little deeper, but we've tried that survey before. It hasn't been too successful. And self-reported, there's no documentation required, so you're just reporting based on the student and teacher conversation or somebody coming in, and that's as good as it gets. So take that for what that's worth. So you kind of have 3 levels of reporting here on employment. And I think Jay's going to get a little bit of this after lunch about the data matching as well.
Yeah. So we've got so that middle block are just the follow-up outcomes for federal reporting. So ABG will be using that in the data match for now. There's a few things like regional living wage, kind of looking at it more longitudinally and so on, some additional employment metrics that we might start exploring in the longer term once we start getting going on this. Okay, we've taught, so Neil mentioned a little bit on SSN. So we're using these methods of self-report. The survey we're not doing for ABG right now, but like I said, there's some issues at the state and federal level where this is a little bit murky now, so there's a little bit of TBD with exactly how we're going to need to do data match and how we might need to do some other things in addition to data match. Hard to say how that will go for now. But for the self-report, we're simply saying get a job, retain a job, enter military for the self-reported employment outcomes, and then increase wages and get a better job for the self-reported wages outcomes. And then, so that's 5 out of the 6. The final one is transition. So we had transition last year, but I've got to say it was very murky, probably the way we had it laid out last year. So it's a little clearer now. One additional difference is there's now 2 broad areas of transition instead of just one. Transition to ASE and then transition to post-secondary. So the transition to ASE is really simple. If the student starts in either ABE or ESL and finishes in ASE, meaning high school diploma or high school equivalency, then that's a transition to ASE outcome. We will be tracking those that move out of ABE or ESL and into secondary. And then the transition to post-secondary, we've got some slides to itemize it out. But the long story short is if you're in K-12 adult ed or community college non-credit and you transition to CTE or 4 credit, you'll get a transition outcome. There's basically 4 different outcomes. So here's 2 of them on this next slide. So one is you're in K-12 adult ed or community college non-credit, ABE, ASE, or ESL, and you enroll in K-12 adult ed, CTE. That's one way. Or you're there and you transition to non-credit community college CTE, that's a second way. Here's the other 2. Number 3, you're starting in K-12 adult ed, ABE, ASE, ESL, and you move into community college 4 credit. Or you're in community college non-credit and you transition to community college 4 credit. So again, you've got those different crosswalks, you might say. Any one of those 4 qualifies for transition to post-secondary. So you could be transitioning into CTE, or you could be transitioning into 4-credit college. So the transition to ASE, there's no bubble. It's just looking and tracking enrollment progress. For transition to career tech ed or college, we're using specific outcomes that you would mark. So if they made that outcome, you would just mark this. So going to it, because you've asked a couple times, there's 2 bubbles in the work side, job training and training, or under education, you can put transition to credit. That one's kind of case specific. And then last year, what we did is we said you could use field 12 or 14, which if you read it, it sort of kind of makes sense, but not really. But we've been using it. It isn't really serving any purpose on the WIOA side, so we'll still use that to record these transition outcomes. You can see we've got the 2 fields on the form. If they end up getting a quote-unquote training outcome, meaning they're in career tech ed, you could mark either one of those, and that that would basically hit the outcome for you. If they were moving to a college setting, you could mark either one of those enrolled in education, and it would do the same thing. So the bottom line is, if you feel like they're making that progress, I don't think there's any guideline that says they've got to do X, they've got to do Y, and they've got to do Z to do the outcome. To some extent, that's your call on that one, so you would just mark one of these if they made that progress. Okay, so this screenshot is just looking at all 6 areas at once. Some like this, some not so much, but if you want this, you can email it to me. I'll send it to you if you want. A lot of people have requested it, but this is just looking at all 6 areas at once. It attempts to just use the same color coding we've used in some of those other slides for the 6 areas, so you can't really see it that well, from the distance, but we've got those same 6 colors representing the 6 areas. And then we've just bubbled the different areas by color, with each color equating to one of those 6 areas of AB 104. So if you want to look at all of it at once, this kind of gives you the color-coded chart related to the update record in terms of which bubbles equate to which of those 6 areas of AB 104. Okay, so a little bit more. We've got about 5 slides, and then we'll break for lunch, but a few more on this. This is on the data match side. So like we said, the primary way we're getting all this data is just self-report and TE, but we are also doing some data matching. So just looking at it outcome-based, there's a few that we won't data match. Obviously, the learning gains with pre-post. Obviously, we're not going to data match that. That's going to be TE only. The other one like that is high school diploma, because that's a local issue, not a state-level issue, so there is no data match. That's based on what you've done locally, so that too is 100% through reported data in TE. The other areas in some way, shape, or form might have some kind of data matching take place depending on the area. So we basically have 3 data matches. There'll be one with the Chancellor's Office that will be looking at the post-secondary and transition outcomes. There's one with the EDD that will look at jobs and wages, and then we'll be doing that CDE HSE match for high school equivalency. So these next couple slides just reiterate what I just said, just segmenting it out a little bit. But here's, basically the 3 data match, one through CDE for high school equivalency, one through EDD for employment, one through the Chancellor's Office for post-secondary. And then this is just looking at it another way, what specific areas are going to be done with each one of those 3 areas of data match. And then this is kind of putting it all into a bowl. Some are calling this, the ping pong balls in the lottery hopper. Some are calling this the 9 olive martini. You decide which one you like better. But bottom line is, this is just trying to represent all the different data elements all in one big hopper. The olive-colored olives, I guess you'd say, represent those 6 areas of AB 104. That is the 6 areas of self-report in TE. The purple olives represent the 3 areas of data match: EDD, Chancellor's Office, and CDE. So here's another one, not quite as popular as the update bubble slide, but some have requested this one as well. This is looking at the same sort of thing, but just looking. Here's the 6 areas of AB 104 and itemizing out which specific outcomes fall under each one of these 6 areas. And this is a transition point. We're closing in on 12, so let's go ahead and break for lunch. We're breaking kind of at a convenient time.
So here's the launch board tab, just to wake you up from your lunch, doldrums. So the launch board tab is here. They're working on it right now. It should be available in the springtime. They're going to test probably starting next month. If all goes well, they'll do some training in the springtime. It'll be available to show your data matching between members and consortia level. As Jay talked about in his data matching slides, it's a combination of college MIS data and TOPS Pro, as well as the HSE vendors like GED, HiSET, and TASC. And then if any students are moving on to universities, we have the National Clearinghouse data as well as EDD data. And then labor market information as well will be in that launch board. So a lot of good information. You'll get a chance to learn about all the 57 metrics. So if you thought this training was a little bit in depth and deep down in the weeds, wait till you get to understand 57 metrics. So a lot of good data out of the launch board. Like I said, testing in the fall, available in the spring, regional training. I'm sure you'll have to go to that regional training a few times before you figure out how to use the launch board. But it's all good. That's kind of the whole intent of having the launch board and using MIS versus TE and having them match data together in the launch board. Okay, so 17, 18, do we remember that supplemental data report we were talking about? Probably not. Yes, no? Okay, the supplemental data report is going to include all that stuff that doesn't get into the main report to the legislature. So these are those real hot topics like credit. Let's say I'm spending, what's happening to our students in credit classes? So right now in the state we have a big issue with adult education students and basic skills developmental education classes. And some of those are credit. Some of those were, using our AEBG funds for supports and services and things like that. So we've made this switch to non-credit. But not everyone's going to be able to move to non-credit as fast as, within a few months, right? So we want to see, we don't want to lose sight of the whole dev ed situation. We don't want to lose sight of how we're affecting change with credit students because ultimately, we want students to get into credit and transferable courses, right? So we want to see what's happening there still. So we're going to, in our supplemental report, we're going to look at what's happening with credit just so we don't lose sight of that because it's a big part, even though it has its own separate fund source and it's not part of this effort that we're tracking. We still want to see what's going on there because there could be something important that we might be missing that when we went to non-credit only, there could be something amazing that's going on there. So we're going to track that. We're also going to track the miracles happening in less than 12 hours. Although, 12 hours or more is the threshold, there could be, minor miracles happening there, like people getting jobs, people getting certificates, who knows. So we want to track that as well. So when Jay was talking about, getting the demographics, even if it's less than 12 hours, you don't have to do that. But if you did and we went to launch board and used that data, it would show up in this report. And so it would fuel the discussion about what we do with less than 12 hours because the feds don't care about less than 12 hours. It's not something that's tracked in the federal program. So we want to track and just see what's going on. Are there jobs happening there, credentials? Is there all these services and supports that are going on that are less than 12 hours? And then if there's other effective practices going on like immigrant integration, career advancement academies. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other things out there that are happening that we want to see what's going on, and we'll track those as well and put those in the supplemental data report. So any questions about that? So I don't know what the format, someone asked me, I think last week or the week before, what's the format of this? And I think we're still working on that. I think at the end of the month we'll decide on what this is going to look like and how we're going to get these data elements. All right, so here's some big other changes for those of you who are slowly fading after lunch. Okay, so we're next month for the college people, I think the college presidents and tech people will receive technical details of how we're going to update MIS to include adult education reporting requirements. So we found out that in MIS there's some missing population flags related to adult education, some program areas like pre-apprenticeship and high school diploma that we can't pull out. So technical specs will be given to the colleges. They'll have to work on this through the year to get MIS up to speed. We'll also be working with CCC Apply. We're already having conversations about that. Of, why aren't adult schools showing up? Why are you asking those questions that are scaring adult students away? All kinds of questions. Now, this will happen. This we'll see because CCC Apply, I guess they want to make the form shorter rather than longer, and what we're asking is to add more fields. So if the intent is to make the form shorter, why would they want to add more adult ed related questions? So we'll see where that goes. But I think they're all in agreement about some of those questions are scaring away some of our adult ed students. And so we will at least want to change that. So we'll see what happens here. We're at least making ourselves aware. I don't know where we are in the priority order of CCC Apply. We're probably a little bit farther down than some of the other people that are complaining about the same stuff. So we'll join forces with them and see what happens. So here we get back to the crosswalk I think Jay alluded to earlier. And there were some questions about the crosswalk. Okay. So we actually have some crosswalk members, I think, in the room. If you're on one of these committees, Math, English, or ESL, and you're not talking to your neighbor, please raise your hand. Okay, so we have a couple of crosswalk committee members here. Netta, you're on which committee? So Netta's on the English, and Diana, you're on the
English as a second language.
English as a second language. So what's happening is you're meeting with K-12 faculty, college faculty in English, math, and ESL, and you're working on a crosswalk from educational functioning levels under the NRS system, and you're looking at CB21, levels below transfer, and the core competencies on that side, which is a college-based system, and you're trying to align and crosswalk through those two different items, right? All right, so if all goes well for 18-19, we'll move you to your MIS system for reporting your students for adult education in those non-credit program areas. So if all those flags and fixes go into MIS this year and it works, so starting in 18-19, we would be grabbing that out of MIS. You wouldn't have to do anything. It would already be in there, so we would already be able to take it. K-12 county offices would still use TE, just like you're using now. If you're WIOA 2 funded, nothing changes. Even if you're a college, you still have to use the pre and post testing and use CASAS and TE and all that stuff. All that stays the same with the WIOA 2 grant. So no changes there. We're moving right along here. Here's a beautiful chart. Not as beautiful as Jay's charts. It's not as requested as Jay's charts. It's probably like number 8 on the chart request chart.
With that plea, it's probably rising up.
No, I think it's on a...
It's getting some sympathy votes.
Yeah, maybe. It's just another way to look at it. So and we're actually down to the resources. So we're going way too fast. Yeah, but I'm going to pull the rabbit out of my hat right now before I turn Jay loose to do the last part. I did have a couple of things I wanted to reiterate as far as fiscal and program changes. So talking about fees, so we were having discussion about fees, and so we're trying to align non-credit, non-fees to K-12 adult and county office programs, but where the rubber hits the road is the CTE area. So until we figure that out, and then there's ed code around there's no ed code around adults with disability or K-12 success or CTE. So until that gets rectified, I think it's going to be status quo. We'll see what the legislature comes back with, or LAO or finance. But until then, the only alignment right now is with ASC, ABE, ESL is similar to that on the non-credit college side where there's no fees. Things about materials and other fees, that's a little difficult to align as well because colleges have no fees for materials. In some cases they can charge, so it's not clear. So that fee thing is very murky. And we'll see where this goes, so no decisions have been made. Also, just some other programming details. If you're a member in multiple consortia, I don't know if, Lake County. Is Lake County here? Big shout out to Lake County. We just have the two consortia. So, Calaveras, okay, shout out to Calaveras. They're between San Joaquin and Stanislaus, is that correct? Okay, so we've provided guidance on that. You know, you have to use a separate TE ID, so we're working through that. That's on the website, so if you happen to have another county office out there that I didn't mention, I mean, we have a few others, like Riverside County office is another one, but other than that, we do have some guidance. If you're going into another district and offering classes, check with your agency, like CDE if you're K-12, if you're college, check with the Chancellor's office on what you need to have in place. So if there's a district that doesn't have any adult ed, and you're offering courses there, check with CDE if you're K-12 to see what you have to have in place to make that happen. Because there was existing ed code that you had to do some certain things in, so I would just check back with CDE on that. On the college side, you do have to have an agreement with that college to allow you to go into that other college district. So you just can't do that. Even if they don't offer adult ed, you still have to have that agreement. 18 years old, we're still adhering to 18 years old for this program. Does anybody have any questions about that? It's age at entry. I think capital outlay does not require state approval, just an information or email. Out-of-state travel still requires approval from the state. Okay, there's the big difference. Indirect rate is still the state approved indirect rate on K-12. Negotiated rate on the college side. We're working to get that fixed, but for this year, it'll stay the same. And then hopefully everybody's getting their money passed through. There's no delays on getting funding, although this year's funding on the K-12 side will come out later this month.
I say we have to get it first.
Yeah, you got to get it first. It's coming. It's at controllers. It just takes 3 weeks from controllers to get out to the...
But these are all just things on the ABG website, a bunch of stuff on there. This is just kind of giving you a list of a lot of the sort of things you'll find. A little bit on the tables. I think I mentioned this, but I can't really remember if I mentioned this publicly or whether it was just in some of the Q&A talk. But if you run the report in TE now, it'll pretty much be the same as it was on August 1. Maybe a few little changes, but a lot of these outcomes we spent the last few hours talking about are new. So we haven't put all the new outcomes in yet. We've been tweaking these outcomes after every training, or tweaking the language on these slides after every training. And we've got...
Did you call this a soft launch, Jay?
Somewhere in between, Luke soft. Anyway, so we're going to be making changes, but probably not for another month or so because there's still a couple of those state level meetings to finalize the changes. Seems kind of likely that there'll be a few more before we're all done with it. But once we're done with it, we'll be tweaking them and adding the new outcomes and probably making some other enhancements too. That being said, here's the screenshot with the menu option. So if you want to go there now and look at some of this stuff, it's all there. And for the most part, it'll be closer to what you need than not. Okay, here's what it looks like. Some of you have seen this. What I've been saying is it's kind of left to right, highest bar to the left, lowest bar to the right, 3 different areas. Let me just see, is the new, so if you look at it now, a minor enhancement that's been done since the screenshot is there's 3 rows that are highlighted in purple to kind of show you the 3 different population subsets, again, left, middle, and right. So the left-hand side is table 4 gains based on federal reporting, looking at the pre-post gains. So I say that's the highest bar because it's requiring hours and requiring demographics. And in addition, it's also requiring pre and post testing. Obviously, in this case, it is because it's looking at those who have pre-post gains, so it's requiring that as well. The middle section called AB 104 outcomes, those are the other 5 areas of AB 104, the secondary, post-secondary employment, and so on. So that middle section is another population subset. It's also requiring hours and demographics, but it's not requiring anything related to testing. So I say a little bit lower bar because it's not really looking at any of that. Then the right-hand side, that would be column I. Those are the short-term services. That's the low bar, not requiring hours, not requiring demographics, obviously not requiring testing. As long as the student has an ID in the database, they will potentially be able to earn some of those short-term services. So we have 3 subsets, again, using 3 different levels of parameters to figure out whether they get on the board or not. So it's basically tracking your outcomes. I guess one of the big changes, obviously, is adding all these new outcomes and so on. Another is we'll be enhancing the drill down. I want to say on August 1, there was some drill down, but not nearly as much as we were really hoping for or intending to have. So we're really looking at attending to that so you can have more outcome-related looks at it rather than just now where it's really more by AB 104 category. Okay, and this just reiterates what I just said, the 3 different levels explaining what each one of those 3 levels reports. Okay, we're talking about resources. So obviously we can't get by without talking about the illustrious ABG website. So here it is in the flesh. I'm sure you've all been there before, whether you like it or not. So here it is. Diana, is there anything worth talking about? I know you guys are kind of enhancing it. Okay, the next slide is, no, nobody switched to, oh, that's what it is we're using. Okay, so there was a new one that we had that we don't have. Okay. So anyway, most of you have probably been here, whether you like it or not, too. This is our website at CASAS. I usually like to say, well, everybody's been here, whether they like it or not, because how did you get to the training to register? But I can't say that this time, because, of course, this one was on the ABG website, not our website. So it's entirely possible that you actually skipped over our website in this specific example. But anyway, we have our website, lots of ABG-related resources here as well. I think the middle 2 bullets are the areas of our website that are worth looking at. We have the California page, which was intended for WIOA, but as you know, a lot of those resources are useful for this purpose as well, and we've added some ABG stuff. We have a special page now for ABG as well. For whatever reason, we really like those little specialty areas where we have little pages for various specialty groups. I'm not sure why that's how we roll, but there's really no question that's how we roll. So we have a lot of these kind of niche pages, you might say. So ABG is a good example of that.